Kia ora tēnā koutou, ko Aotearoa te maunga ko te matuku te moana no tamakia ho. Ko Whenek toku whānau, ko Iwi toku ingoa. Kia ora everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for an update on one of the current major work streams happening within the Aotearoa Circle, the Marine Adaptation Strategy. And I'm feeling very connected to this work today as I sit looking out my window at the great moana that wraps around this place. And I might even give you all a quick glimpse so we can just feel connected to the things that we are talking about. So I am Iwi Whenek Engagement Director for the Circle, but the session will be largely hosted by Dr. Stefan Gray, who is leading the Secretariat work out of KPMG, one of the Aotearoa Circle's partners, and we also have Maru Samuels with us today, CEO of the Iwi Collective and co-chair alongside Dan Bolger on this work stream. Kia ora, Maru and Steph. Before I hand you over to Steph, a couple of general housekeeping things. If you could pop yourself on mute, and if you have a question during the session, just put the little emoji hand up and we'll come to you. We're also going to create some time at the end for anyone to ask Steph or Maru any questions that they have. So, and also, as I say in all of these webinars, please let me know after the session if there's anything specifically you'd like an update on when it comes to the Aotearoa Circle work. Next month, we'll be looking to do an update on the food work that is currently underway. So this work stream is phase 2 of the marine work out of the Circle. In July 2020, the Circle and KPMG released the climate-related risk scenarios for 2050, exploring plausible futures for aquaculture and fisheries in New Zealand. And Steph is going to take us through this scenario planning work to set the scene for the adaptation strategy that we're currently in at the moment. The strategy work is still in the really early stages of development, and much of what Steph is going to be sharing with us is still subject to change, open to feedback, so don't hold anything as set in stone. This is essentially a sneak peek into what is happening under the hood of this work. So on that note, I will hand you over to Steph.
Kia ora Iwi. Ko tūrangariri tōku monga, ko Waikato tōku awa, ko Gray tōku iwi, ko Steph tōku ingoa. No te whanganui a tara a hau, hei mātanga hāpai te kaitiaki taiu, kei KPMG o e mahi ana, no reira tēnā koutou. Kia ora. Thanks, Iwi, for that. I'm going to subject you to a fair bit of PowerPoint hell, but not too much, because we want to get through to a Q&A session at the end of it. So I might just start sharing that with you now. Oh. Can I just be enabled, whoever's got the power to do that?
Give Steph the power.
Yeah, give me, oh, there we go. I just got to find the right screen.
Hang on a minute, I'm just working out how to.
Looks like it's working.
Oh, you got it? Good stuff.
Yep.
Perfect.
Cool. So unfortunately for everyone, you will be subject to a significant quantity of slides. But welcome. A good friend of mine, Joe, once told me that people can remember 3 things. So I won't go any further than 3 different topics we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about Marine 1, which is developing the climate-related risk scenarios. Then Marine 2, the second tranche of work that we're doing with the Aotearoa Circle, which is the sector adaptation strategy. And then we'll give you this, as you were saying, this very sneaky preview. So don't repeat anything that you see today, just keep it under your hat, but we're happy to have feedback about it. So who are we? The we in this instance is that we're the facilitation team, which is KPMG Impact. There's a bit of a wag in the link to this to say, well, why are accountants talking about this? And I was actually quite delighted to be mistaken for an accountant, because to me that's actually coming up in the social strata considerably. What I am is actually a geographer, and I work in KPMG under the KPMG Impact banner, under the climate change and decarbonisation branch there. And I have an amazing team that works with me, because people like me tend to have very flouncy big ideas about things and like to be very creative about how we can go about our work, but you need the intellectual horsepower and the rigor and the discipline and the capability of young people such as Annie, Jamie, and Sydney who can actually do things. So I think Maru will join me in thanking this crew for facilitating all of the work that you're about to hear about now. So that's the kind of the KPMG who, and just bear in mind in all the work that follows here, both through Marine 1 and Marine 2, this is a really participatory, stakeholder-driven work via the Aotearoa Circle. That's where the Aotearoa Circle plays best, when it brings together business, government, all of those key actors who can really affect change. So all the work you're about to see is really, really beholden to them. So to start with the sort of bare fundamentals of what we're going to talk about, and that is what is climate-related risk. And so those in the know will find this a really boring slide to look at, and to be fair, those who aren't in the know will also find it a really boring slide to look at. But accountants are the way of the future in terms of changing the way that our economy works, in terms of its capacity to generate unwanted consequences, its negative externalities. And in this instance, via the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, they are the way of winkling out investments and asset classes and things that are not aligned with our desire to be net zero by 2050. And in particular, this framework, this amazing little framework we have here, the governance strategy, risk management, metrics and targets under the TCFD recommended disclosures work, there's a little thing in the bottom here, this final disclosure in the strategy piece, this innocuous looking, describe the resilience of the organization's strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2 degrees C or lower scenario. Sounds easy enough. But when you think about what are scenarios and what do we do with them, well, they're narratives. Effectively, they are, and I've, for my sins, I have a PhD in this particular field, so I've read a lot about this stuff, and one of the doyens of this kind of work, Herman Kahn, who was at the Rand Corporation, described them as narrative descriptions from which causal linkages can be drawn. They aren't predictions, they're not probabilistic, because if you could do predictive probabilistic work, then you're working more with risk. Scenarios are about uncertainty. So they're about trying to get to the heart of things that we cannot easily use probability distributions about. What they need to be is plausible and internally coherent and focused on decision relevant factors so that people can use them to better understand risk and make good strategic decisions. So in this instance, if you look at an investment choice or a strategy in the case of the marine area about what you're going to fish or how you're going to fish, imagine it was that aircraft in that wind tunnel. You'd want it to be stress tested against things that it could plausibly encounter out in the wild, not just the base reference case, the average condition that it's going to find. I certainly wouldn't want to fly something that had only been in average conditions rather than the most plausible envelope of the things that it could encounter in the air. So that's the approach that we use for scenario analysis. Well, which scenarios? And the TCFD are quite explicit here in that they want at least two, and one of them has to be this aggressive mitigation scenario that you see on the right-hand side there, where we're actually on track to keeping global warming to 2 degrees or lower by the end of the century. And in the case of the case that I'm sort of working you through now, we also did a kind of, if you like, an aggressive physical risk scenario, which is unfortunately business as usual. And so that's the other end of that risk spectrum. Business impacted by climate change on the left side there, and business impacted by policy change on the right. So some examples of what's at either end of those spectrum, the physical and the transition risk. In a marine context, thinking about examples of physical climate-related risks, with more than 90% of the energy that we've accumulated due to climate change having been absorbed into the ocean, and particularly the top layers of the ocean, there are some pretty significant changes to the way that heat is distributed around the world, how things like La Nina events unfold, the interdecadal Pacific Oscillation, those kind of things, how the thermohaline circulation works around the world is changing. And the effects of that is that the abundance and distribution of species is changing quite drastically as well. So you find fish species in places that they weren't prior. So when I was working back in Europe, there was a mackerel fishery that migrated up into Iceland that had been around Ireland. And in a New Zealand context, it had kingfish turning up in the deep south where it hasn't normally been, so people don't have quota to fish it. So it's quite difficult for them to work around that. And you've also seen instances of things like zooplankton struggling to grow and develop due to the acidification in the oceans. And that has other implications for things like aquaculture when you're thinking about things like mussel spat or oyster larvae. And we've already seen instances in the Pacific Northwest where oyster fisheries have been pretty badly affected by acidification in the oceans. So those are some examples of the types of things that we're thinking about in physical climate-related risks that featured in our scenario analysis. And then when you think about the transition climate-related risks that you have to deal with, it's almost, because there's humans in the mix in this side of the thing, there's almost no limit on the various degrees of freedom that can come into the system. So you can have the policy side of things, the regulations, the economic responses, consumer choices, all of these different aspects come into a transition analysis when you're thinking about climate-related risk. So one of the examples we had there was a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a European one that we put into the mix there for exporters who are not doing as well in terms of their emissions reductions. We also brought into play the introduction of alternate proteins, who, even if it's a perception, a consumer perception that wild species are vanishing from waters, then you would expect to see some shift away from wild capture fisheries. And as Juliet Gerard has pointed out, when it is so difficult to establish what is a fact in the marine environment, then it's really quite difficult to be able to tell a coherent story about what is sustainably caught and what is not. So within the transition scenario, we factored in some kind of consumers moving away from both aquaculture and fisheries on the basis of perception of sustainability. Those are just some examples of types of things that you would see in those types of scenarios. So what does that sort of thing look like in practice? And so this is why when you look at a slide like that, this is why you'd rather be cornered at a party by an accountant than cornered at a party by someone like me, because this is the type of work that we do in relation to trying to get a framework to blend qualitative and quantitative data to create projections of change that we can work with in developing scenarios. So what you see on the left there is a risk framework, for particularly a marine climate-related risk framework, which we have adapted to incorporate different sort of forcing at its boundary by different scenario configurations. So we use different representative concentration pathways, shared socioeconomic pathways at a global level, different New Zealand level scenarios, to get the interaction of all of those different social ecological system components there, the management, the governance, the economy, the market, and the marine ecosystem and ocean biogeochemistry. And that spits out some really interesting little markers that we can use to tell interesting stories about how risk can evolve. And that's what you see on the right-hand side, is some of the sort of infographic type outputs that we use with the scenarios in that case. And the keen-eyed among you will see that has changed under a transition risk scenario. We use a different configuration of boundary forcing scenarios, different RCPs, different SSPs. So those are the shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios that give global outputs of where the economy is at. Different physical drivers on the left-hand side there. And as you see, that the outputs that we then end up with are slightly different under the transition risk scenario. So in particular, that right-hand little quadrant there about megatons of CO2 equivalent per year is really significantly different in this setting than it was in the other. And things like global population and GDP were quite different as well.
The same system where my understanding of my very limited understanding.
And so where that's resolved to, in terms of looking at risks and opportunities, which is really what you're trying to do with these scenario analyses, is to try to understand what the different risks and opportunities under a physical risk scenario and a transition risk scenario are going to be, to help decision makers to come to some better strategic choices about how to further their aims in developing their strategies in the marine space. So just a couple of examples of things that came out of the physical risk scenario side. The distribution of QMS species is quite markedly different under the physical risk scenario. In particular, the species migrating out of northern quota management areas, and unless there's some kind of significant differences in the way that we manage that in the regulatory side, then there'll be fishes that are out of pocket, and there'll be barriers to effective fishing in all areas when the distribution of quota is incommensurate with the distribution of species. An example of some risk on the transition side is that costs will rise significantly because we need to be better at dealing with negative externalities of things like fishing and aquaculture. So we need to start thinking about how to deal with those rising costs and how to really get ahead of the curve and turn them into an advantage in our position globally in markets. And there were definitely opportunities as well that we tried to identify in those different scenarios, because those opportunities create adaptive capacity space. So identifying those was actually really helpful in both scenarios. Again, this changes in the abundance of distribution of species creates a few wins as well as losses. And in particular, the opportunities on the transition risk side is taking advantage of some of the inherent governance components of the system in New Zealand that actually stack up pretty well if you start to use them in your favor in terms of things like co-governance arrangements with iwi and having an iwi lens brought to sustainability and ecosystem governance works really strongly in our favor in terms of not just the story we can tell, but the way that we manage our resources. So we started to draw out some of that in the scenario analysis in the end. And the key conclusions that we took from that work and the group took from that work and coming through to transition into Marine 2, I'll draw your attention in particular to the last three on that right-hand side, that multi-stakeholder collaboration was the key thing that they found from working through that first phase, because the style of impact and the style of responses to those impacts under both scenarios were not things that individual organizations could address coherently themselves. They needed to be able to collaborate, because there's always the risk of one group's adaptation options being negative external consequences for another. Similarly, there was a conception that we're not too late to do anything about these things. We have a little time, particularly the fact that we have in global terms, a relatively benign location, just because where we sit in the world, we're a little more fortunate than some others, but we don't have much time. So we really need to get on with things, particularly in this next decade. So this is why the group decided that working on an adaptation strategy would be the best option to start to try and accelerate and address some of these key conclusions from the scenario work. So that's a quick recap of how Marine 1 got us into Marine 2, the second tranche of work the Aotearoa Circle is doing to develop a climate change adaptation strategy. And sort of adaptation orthodoxy would have you look at your hazards, look at your exposure, try and understand your vulnerabilities, and look at what you can work with to try and increase and enhance your resilience in dealing with those exposures and vulnerabilities. And we felt that we'd started some of that work via the scenario analysis, started to highlight some of that stuff, and it was becoming nicely crystallized in terms of the ideas that people felt they needed to be dealing with, but it was an opening salvo. So to take it further and enhance the resilience of Aotearoa's seafood sector and Aotearoa more broadly, we wanted to work with a strategy. And as Ian and I were chatting before we came into this about what the difference between strategy, adaptation strategy, and then maybe like sectoral strategy is. And as somebody who's, you know, nerdy about this kind of stuff and can wax a little bit, be quite boring about it, I didn't want to get too much into the weeds, but the key difference, I guess, is there is an orthodox approach to adaptation strategy development. And you understand what's happening, and then you plan how to assess, prioritize, and implement options, and then you manage those options. And it almost never goes that way, but that's the kind of backbone approach to adaptation, where you just think about what's coming down your way, think about what you can do about it, and then think about what the best way to manage those options are. But in a circumstance like ours, we're working across the sector, and it's voluntary and collaborative, and there's a lot of differences in the challenges that people face and the adaptive capacities that they have to deal with those challenges. There's some really foundational stuff that needs to be done prior to moving into that more sort of orthodox phase of adaptation work, where you're able to get stakeholders onto the same page and seeing things in, if not necessarily the same, but certainly similar enough ways to be able to collaborate and work together, and sort of striking upon what all those shared concerns and motivations and desired outcomes are, is a key part of that. But the information itself isn't enough. You need to have enabling frameworks. You need effectively sort of institutions, really, to be able to make the thing work. So that's where we've started with this work, is to try and really start at that kind of key foundational piece of work that need to be done first. And to do that, and to sort of start that sort of institutional process, we have a fantastic leadership group, and in particular our co-chairs, who have been amazing to work with. And we have one of them on the call. Dan has been called away to an urgent meeting, but Maru is with us today. And apart from, as I keep telling you, Maru being rakishly handsome, you're also fabulous to work with, and have been a real inspirational leader for us and brought a lot of mana to it. Dan's not here, so I can say that he's been as hugely collaborative and is calling me at all hours of day and night, and is really invested in this, and has been really, really good to work with as well. Supporting the co-chairs, we have this group, this leadership group, drawn from a range of different parts of the seafood system. So we have iwi fisheries, we have the finance sector, we have one of the most successful sort of groups in Sanford who have done really well in recent years in trying to innovate and change. We have the science system there, Volker and John representing NIWA and Cawthron. And we have, via Olivia, we have an ENGO representative. Gary's there for that aquaculture lens. Lisa's not had as much time available to her as she would have wanted, so has been sort of in and out, but we're connecting back with Lisa again on Friday to try and get up to speed on things and draw her into the process, because as you'll see as we talk a little bit further, it's an evolving piece of work, and it's where we are right now is only ever a working draft, and I think that's the way it'll stay all the way through the life of the adaptation strategy. Supporting them, we also have an advisory group of some of the leading thinkers and scientists and actors out in the seafood social ecological system. So we got them all sort of covered off there. I won't go into details, but they've been fabulous to work with and very, very informative for us. So how we did it, you know, it is a participatory, explicitly very participatory approach, because it cannot be a top-down thing. It has to be developed by the people who will use it and who will implement it. The approach that we took was to sort of split it into two branches. The first of those, the Rangihatua Tahi and Workshop 1, was the first survey and the first series of workshops about what that high-level stuff is that's going to get disparate stakeholder groups onto the same page. So that was all the things about vision and guiding principles and the strategic goals that goes with those. And the second tranche of work was where all of the social capital and the goodwill and everything that had been built up by people working together reasonably comfortably on that big high level vision stuff, where it sort of hit the road when we come to objectives and commitment and who's going to do what and how are they going to do it. So that was the second survey data process, Aotearoa and workshops 2 and 3. And we used a couple of established methods there: theory of change and design thinking, just to facilitate the process to make it as light as possible a burden on these voluntary collaborators that we were working with. Won't go into detail about this, but theory of change is just a way of working from what the problem is that you're trying to solve through to the solutions that can get you there. And it's just a structured way of doing that. And it works really pretty well with the design thinking approach as well, because part of that definition phase that is up on screen there is about defining what the problems are. You then go into a broad ideation phase where you think about what the potential solutions are, and then come back down to a narrower validation phase and reiterate those phases. And we're still very much reiterating those phases right now. So we have something of a working draft, but it is pretty rough and ready, and it has a lot left to do on it. So to just whip you through a quick preview of that working draft, this is the structure that it follows. So there's vision, strategic goals, specific objectives, and then key commitments that come from those objectives. So a sneak preview of what the draft vision is. It is a thriving marine environment, blue economy, and seafood community. This was arrived at via the survey data of all of the people that you're seeing up on screen there, having to think about what they believe the vision should be for our adaptation strategy. And that's accompanied by a mission statement. As Kaitiaki, we work together to adapt to climate change and ensure a resilient future. Our strategic goals are broken into two kind of tranches, the first being the culture and well-being, the second being systems and settings. And the first strategic goal under that cultural and well-being tranche is bold leadership. We share a clear common purpose and take collective responsibility for leading change. And that's because our stakeholders saw that leadership was going to be critical, particularly when you're in a collaborative space. Having enough courage and determination in a leadership kind of context to be able to take a pretty disparate stakeholder group with you and your own stakeholders who may not be a party to the same kind of information as you are at the top tables, about how to move them forward through these kind of processes. The leadership itself wouldn't be enough. It needed to be bold leadership. The second strategic goal was resilient prosperity, because fundamentally what we're talking about are commercial enterprises who are involved in this work, and the Aotearoa Circle has scoped it in such a way that it's the seafood system of New Zealand, of Aotearoa, that we need to be working with. And so the second goal there is resilient prosperity. Our businesses are effectively adapting to disruptive market changes, and in so doing, they are stewarding marine ecosystems, because there is no resilient prosperity without ecological resilience. The third strategic goal, practical knowledge. Our knowledge systems support innovation and good decision-making about climate-related risks and opportunities. And this one came about through our stakeholders recognizing that in as much as there is a lot of good information out there already, there are significant gaps, and there are certainly parts of the puzzle that they need help with in terms of working through not just the scientific data and information that may not be there, but also how do we integrate mātauranga coherently and clearly in our adaptation decision making? How do we have multiple sort of framings of what it is that we're talking about, so that we are able to have a truly bicultural approach to working through different conceptions of what good would look like and how it would be implemented? And also, how are we able to make structured decisions on the basis of evidence? What's good enough in terms of the evidence supporting those decisions? And the final strategic goal is one around values-based governance, which has been taken a lot of negotiation to get to a point where it currently stands, and it will still need more refinement to be able to get it across the line of where people are comfortable, I think. But the key drivers here was the adaptive capacity is somewhat constrained by the legislative, regulator, and resource management systems as they currently stand. And that was made quite evident by just even simple things like when species change where they are, we don't necessarily have a very responsive regulatory system to be able to adjust to that. So we aren't, that's just one example, but there's plenty out there of how adaptive are our regulatory and governance systems in relation to the challenges that are faced on all sides of the equation, both from a conservation side, on a commercial side, on a cultural side. Are they able to accommodate the types and scales of change that are coming down the pipe at us? We also have a series of principles that the stakeholders came to. The first being honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi. The second being a whole of systems approach to considering how to go about adaptation. Demonstration of agility and urgency and a focus on what matters, and taking a knowledge-based approach, explicitly thinking through different types and strands of knowledge, and also an intergenerational focus, so that the long term can be really brought to the fore in adaptation planning. So to give you a little bit more of a sneak peek under the hood, just before I run out of time, one of our strategic goals, practical knowledge, has a specific, very technical, specific objective to it about vulnerability assessment. So vulnerability to climate change within the sector will be assessed by identifying climate-related hazards, assessing exposure to them, and gauging sensitivity to their impacts. That again has some very, very technical but very focused commitments that sit underneath it. And the reason I'm sort of flashing it up on screen in front of you now is just to give you a flavour of what the stakeholders have been grappling with and the level that they have gone to in terms of just thinking through coherently how to go about getting adaptation work flowing from the strategy, so that it's not just a high-level plan, it is an effective action-oriented piece of work that can immediately spur action. So in this case, it's all about trying to do some of that technical stuff that sort of adaptation orthodoxy would say is, you know, one of your key sort of first steps is to really understand how vulnerability is affecting all of your key stakeholders in terms of what they need to do and when. The next piece that I want to just quickly talk you through again without giving too much away or going too much over time, there's also a specific objective under the bold leadership strategic goal, which is we will identify the adaptation options available to us and reach agreement on when and how they will be implemented, which again is just an illustration of where this group of stakeholders really wanted to go in terms of pushing for adaptation action. So in this instance, they have broadly agreed that an adaptation options pathways map is the right way to go, using ISO 14090 aligned adaptation action planning, and then finding ways through that adaptation options map and looking to monitoring and evaluation via ecological and socioeconomic resilience monitoring. But this is all still very much a work in progress. So none of the work that I've just whipped through then has actually been through any kind of final check and balance process either by the leadership group or co-chairs. And so where we are now is continuing to evolve and refine both the context and the content of the strategy. So we're looking to really just get those guide rails in place about what the strategy, what the context of the strategy in particular needs to be. It's a tangaloa first perspective, but how does that work in terms of flowing through the rest of the work in the strategy to be what it needs to be for the people who use it. We're going to continue to incorporate feedback on that, and we're having offline korero where we're still workshopping things. We're still meeting with our leadership group, and when we're getting closer to that sort of level of completion on what the strategy is going to look like, then we're going to start a dissemination phase, and that will be a way to talk to other sectors and talk to other people involved in adaptation in New Zealand, to explore some of the strengths and weaknesses of how we've gone about doing what we're doing, and try and share some of what we've learned, and in turn learn from others about how to improve it, because it's going to keep evolving and changing as we go. So I think that's the last of the death by PowerPoint, Izzy. So if you want to maybe take over, and we can bring Maru into the conversation. As well.
Thank you, Steph. We've got about 10 minutes for questions before I hand over to Maru for a final say. And I think while everyone is preparing their own question, I might start, Steph. And my question is probably quite obvious in terms of my role as engagement director with the Aotearoa Circle, but the sharing you've given us around the benefits of that collaborative approach to building a strategy like this, and the combination of private and public sector coming together to explore this. I'm keen to understand how you see the implementation of this benefiting from that collaboration versus just the setting up of a strategy being inputted by that mix of people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fundamental to it, and you know, all the people that we've flashed up on screen there have just been phenomenal to work with, and it's been I've done a wee bit of work in fisheries before, particularly in Europe, and it can be quite a fractious, kind of difficult area to work in, but this group have just been really collaborative. We've had a good time in all the workshops and things that we've done, and there's a good bit of social capital in how they're speaking with each other and speaking with us, and I think that's going to be really important to try and hold together when they're thinking through, okay, well, we've got outlines of things, we've got some plans about things that we can do next, but then when it comes to actually implementing these things, then there's going to be a lot of not just collaboration, but there's going to need to be trade-offs made, and there's resources that need to be expended, and so how that's going to work, that has to be a collaborative undertaking between everybody in that mix. Everyone needs to buy into it. It can't be an NPI thing. It can't just be a commercial sector thing. And you can't have any NGOs on the outside sort of waving sticks and saying, why aren't you doing it this way? And it has to have iwi at the center. So it has to be that collaborative mix in order to be implementable.
I guess then the second part to my question is, we've talked a lot about the benefits. Can we get realistic in some of the challenges as well?
Yep. Whenever you do anything collaboratively and voluntarily, then it becomes, as when people have been really patient with us as a facilitation team and all the workshops, but you end up with this weird mix. So you take a whole bunch of stakeholder input data and you average it and you put it up in front of people, and it makes very little sense, but it's reflective of what everybody's put up onto the page. And people have stuck with us through that. And so, but you have to go through that process of working through an average of views to get to a more focused view that people can actually agree on, which means that of course there are compromises.
We've got a question here from Matt Rayburn, which I think sort of builds on that a little bit. Great presentation, Steph, which I agree. Did you encounter regulatory and policy barriers that could discourage collaboration in the sector? How did you deal with them? Any lessons learned for collaborating on adaptation in other sectors?
Yeah, good point, Matt. And that's, I think we didn't encounter them at the start, but we're becoming more cognizant of them now when you get through to, well, what are you going to do and how are you going to do it? And some of the ideas, so what you saw, this governance review piece, is there are barriers to collaborate. In some instances, there are competitive barriers to collaboration, but there are also regulatory ones that need to be overcome for people to be able to affect the changes that they want to see. And so they're definitely there. The only insights I think we could probably offer from this experience is having enough of the owners, and Matt is somebody who's in his previous career has been part of building up some of these regulatory tools and things, and he understands that process really well. Is having those people in the room with you to help guide you through all that, what's feasible, what's the time scale, and sometimes just immediately don't even start going down that route, because that's just not going to happen. So that's really good. And Matt's got a huge network of those that he can pull into those kind of circumstances anyway. But so we, in our instance, we had a bunch of really helpful people from MPI to help us sort of understand an MFE, to help us understand what the lay of that land is, what's possible and what's not.
Nice. Any other final questions before I hand over to Maru? Nothing is popping up, which I think just says, Stefan, you've done a great job of explaining everything so well. No one has any questions to add. So thank you so much for your time, Stefan, everyone. Maru, I will hand over to you. Kia ora.
Kia ora Izzy. Kia tātou e huhui manei tēnei rā, tēnei te mihi mahana kia koutou, te kaupapa te rā ko te māhuru Māori, nō reira ka tika ka nui te mihi mahana kia koutou ko Maru Samuels, tēnei he uri ahau no Naitarangi, te raroa, te aupauri nai takoto hoki. Nō reira ki ngā iwi o te motu, tēnei te mihi mahana, tēnā tātou. Kia ora everyone. Look, purposefully wanted to come in at the end. Really, I think just reflects the role that Dan Bolger and I have played, which is just to try and be a little bit of oil in the machine, small cogs in the bigger process, and you know, it reflects the awesome leadership team that we've got, KPMG supporting that, and also Aotearoa circle as well. My main focus in this particular strategy has been around, as Steph alluded, and as all of us know, that in this particular industry, there aren't too many good examples of us collaborating across the industry. And being CEO of the Iwi Collective Partnership and keeping 19 iwi together for 11 years is a huge challenge, and there's some big learnings in that. And that's been my primary focus as co-chair, is just to help our leadership team to achieve that. We're off to a good start. Implementation is the key, keeping that waka together as we roll out the strategy is going to be the key. But not to underestimate the value of collaboration within the seafood marine sector. So just wanted to mihi to that, to everyone's efforts. Kia kotahi te hoi. We continue to work together. And thanks for organising and being part of this today. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you, Maru, and thank you everyone for your time today. There'll be another session like this next month on food, and as this work stream develops, also we'll drag Steph and Maru and Dan back to give us an update maybe in a few months. So ka kite everyone, stay safe and well, and I will see you next time. Mate wa.